The chapter I was assigned was William Essig's Chapter 16, Storytelling, Effects of Planning, Repetition, and Context. And one thing I really liked about this chapter was its opening. It started out with a discussion of storytelling, and there's this great quote that says, ever since humankind began to communicate orally, there have been stories to be told. And this is a reminder to me and to teachers that as we teach language, we are sharing something that's an ancient, early desire and human need. So for Essig, in this chapter, the task is simply tell an interesting story. But Essig is also aware that for EFL students and ESL students, storytelling can be a challenge. So for Essig, the main point is that he wants his students to focus on the meaning of their story and tell an interesting story. And he gives them a couple opportunities to do so, and that's the main purpose of this research study. It's first of all to see what task repetition does for storytelling. And the second purpose of the study is to compare the differences between how students share when they're sharing in private groups and small groups, and then how they share when they are sharing in public groups, such as in front of the entire class. And the participants in this study were 8 randomly selected female students in Essig's own speech communication class, and this was at a women's junior college in Japan. It's a small scale study, so just 8 students total. Their levels range from high elementary to low intermediate, and these students were placed into 2 groups of 4, Group A and Group B, which I will explain in just a moment. And the students were given a task, of course. They were told to tell a story, and the prompt for the story was they were supposed to think of an unusual, happy, exciting, frightening, or memorable experience to share with their groups. So just tell a story about some experience that they had. So the guidelines for the groups, in these groups of 4, they chose who went first, who went second, who went third, and who went fourth. And for each student was given the chance to tell the full story from beginning to end. And the other students needed to pay attention to the stories. And then at the very end of the story, they needed to ask questions about content, details, and misunderstandings after hearing the story. So, for example, the first student would go, he would share the story, and the others would listen and then ask questions. And then the second person would go, and they would share their story, and then the others would ask questions until all 4 students in each group had gone. So that was the first telling of the story. And after all the students had shared, they had 15 minutes to use their dictionaries, ask for help from their peers, from their classmates, and from the teacher, and to make notes, to prepare to retell their stories. And as I mentioned, these students were placed into 2 groups. Group A was what is called the private-public group. So these students first told their stories in private in their small groups like everybody else. And then the second time they told their stories, they told it in public to the rest of the class. So that was Group A. And the second group was Group B, of course. And this was the private group. These students also told their stories in private the first time, but then the second time when they retold their stories, they told it in private again, just with their groups. So Essig had 8 possible outcomes. These were his hypotheses for the study. And the first 5 hypotheses were just talking about task repetition. And then 6, 7, and 8 are about the comparisons between the 2 groups, Group A and Group B. And to test these hypotheses, he tape recorded his classrooms, and then he looked at each of these hypotheses one by one. And he mentions that his students were fairly used to the tape recorder being present in the classroom, so it didn't affect their ability to speak and tell their stories by this time. So he transcribed the audio recordings and then analyzed the transcripts. So hypothesis 1 was, it said that task repetition would result in a greater number of clauses produced by the students during the task completion. So for this one, he found that the second narratives in group A and B actually had a decrease in the average number of clauses. So there was one student who embellished her story with extra dialogue, and which increased the number of clauses in her story. But for most students, the general trend was that the transcripts reveal the tightening up of the narratives. And most students, he guesses, they seemingly attempted to make their second narratives more concise and compact than the first ones. His second hypothesis, hypothesis 2, was that there would be fewer pauses in the retelling of the narrative. So the second time they told the story, he was guessing they would pause less. And he noticed that hypothesis 2 was supported to some degree in both groups. In group A, 2 students paused much less when they retold their stories, and the other 2 paused a little less the second time. So this was somewhat supported. And then in group B, all 4 of the students showed a dramatic decrease in the number of pauses produced in their second narrative. So telling the story the second time helped them to pause fewer times. For hypothesis 3, which said an obvious increase in fluency would occur in the narrative, there were mixed results. So for the most part, there were increases in the rates of speech, which he details in his appendix. The words per minute, length of pauses, and repetitions decreased for most students to some degree. But one student had more repetitions in her story because she tried to add more information the second time around. And this student also experienced more pauses in her story. Hypothesis 4 said that planning time before repeating the task would allow the students to incorporate a wider variety of lexis and vocabulary, and this was supported by both groups. They both showed a wider variety of vocabulary in their narratives, as the transcript showed. And hypothesis 5 was that the second narrative would have greater lexical density. This was not supported by either group. And he makes some interesting speculations in response to Group A and Group B. He speculates that perhaps the goal of Group A was to produce a story that was clearer and more concise, as opposed to having more vocabulary density. And then with his analysis for Group B, he speculates that the students may have been more concerned with better fluency and accuracy than with trying to expand or lengthen their narratives. Hypotheses 6, 7, and 8 were about comparing the two groups. For hypothesis 6, he said that public display would be more accurate than private narratives. And both groups actually improved between the first and second telling of their narratives. And he points out that hypothesis 6 was supported, and that the results show that public display of narratives may cause students to pay more attention to the accuracy of their utterances, and he calls this a crucial element of task-based learning, because there's questions about whether task-based learning leads to accuracy, but this shows that this public display and the reporting of their stories to the full classroom did help them become more accurate. Hypothesis 7 was that public presentations would have more lexical density, and this could not be supported. The public display group, in fact, did show an increase, and the private display group showed a decrease in lexical density. However, the crucial thing he says is the private group actually had a higher lexical density in both the first and second narrative, so this could not be supported. And then finally, for hypothesis A, which said that public presentations would have a higher degree of fluency, this was supported. The public group had fewer pauses, fewer repetitions, and a faster speech rate than the private group. So in the end, Essig concludes that task repetition, in fact, does tend to result in second narratives that are more fluent and accurate than the first narratives. So if we are giving our students a storytelling activity, it might be a good idea to give them a couple opportunities to, one time practice it and then say it again. And the other conclusion that he makes is that sharing the second repetition in public also tends to result in a more fluent and accurate second narratives. So that's helpful to know. He gives a caution that this is just a small scale study and there's more research that could be done in a larger setting to justify or clarify the data with more evidence. He has his own questions about his own study. He raises some questions about variables that were not directly part of the study, such as what would students do if they had more preparation time? So instead of just 15 minutes, maybe have a few more minutes, like 20 minutes? Or less time, 10 minutes? How would that change the narratives? The number of repetitions, for example, these students told their stories twice, once in private and then in public, or then in private again. And what would happen if we give them 3 opportunities to tell their story? And then how do they feel about repetitions? How do they feel about telling their story more than one time? Do they enjoy telling their story twice? Just what do they think about it? And then there are other questions related to feedback, language acquisition, personality, and input. Feedback is such as, the students helping each other out versus the teacher helping out, or the dictionaries using the dictionaries. How do they think about the words because they're saying the words twice? The personality, are shy students helped by practicing, or do they become more outgoing? He speculates on other questions. And then how does this help input as well? Other studies could address questions like that. So for me, I found this a helpful study to read. I thought the chapter was neatly organized and the research questions were clearly identified and studied. There were a few moments when I wish that more data could have been shared, or that the data would have been analyzed more holistically. For example, he didn't talk too much about the topic of making a story more interesting, besides just kind of analyzing these data points, repetitions and how much accuracy. And maybe there could have been more information about the students' perspective on the changes they made in their own stories and how they felt about the process. But overall, I did feel that it was a very helpful study to read, and it definitely proves that, or helps to suggest that the accuracy and the fluency of the stories are not hurt by the students focusing on the meaning of the task. They did have opportunities to do the task twice, and sharing it encouraged them to be accurate and fluent. And in my own teaching this week, I've actually been inspired to focus a little more on storytelling as the basis for more lessons, just give more opportunities for students to share stories with each other, with me, with the whole class. And I've been reflective about the balances in my class between private group time and public sharing. Try to do both, and I'm still thinking about that one. And I've been encouraged to offer my students more opportunities to repeat speaking tasks, and that has helped my classes, I think. And I'm going to continue to reflect on this chapter. I'm also considering doing a similar storytelling prompt in my own classes and seeing how it works out. Okay, so thank you for listening. If you're interested, it's chapter 16. Thank you.